further. Thanks, B. Cool. I'll get cracking now. Nice to meet you guys. I'm Chris. I come from 507 Climate. Built that business with a friend of mine over a year ago now. And I've got background basically in ESG consulting and sustainability consulting over a couple of years now. Very much focused on all sorts of sectors. So I've started off with financial players like JP Morgan, BlackRock, and so on, like really on their private fund side. There's a lot of regulation going on, especially in the financial space, as some of you might know, when it comes to sustainability. So there's a lot of work going on there as well. And this is where I started off, ventured into construction, ventured into all sorts of sectors, and really focused on the climate side of things, because that's what I'm passionate about. What we do at 507 Climate is, carbon footprints, obviously, getting the data done, how high are your actual carbon emissions, and we work with all sorts of clients and organizations there. We're not really here to just make some money and finding a good sector to start off in. We're really trying to, call out greenwashing and get proper action done with people that actually want to do something. As I said, lots of regulations going on. It's quite a minefield for organizations trying to operate it. So we're obviously helping their carbon offsets. We hear about sort of like tree planting every day. On products, on advertisement, and so on, but there's a lot of BS in there as well. So we're working through that. And then obviously, once all of the data and regulation side is done for people, we then really make sure that we set good targets for organizations, and then the following climate action plans to actually meet those targets and not just talk about it, basically. So that's us. And what I just thought I'd do is just give you obviously a bit of a knowledge nugget here, really, on if you're keen on doing it yourself, if you're keen to speak to people like myself or also Holly on what you can do. I just want to say I currently work on the side as well for a construction company, and we sort of consult very small SMEs, like road surfacing SMEs. So everyone can do something. It is not always a big task to get like a bit of data done and a climate action plan. So it is really possible. It's not just with the big companies to do something. So do let us know if you want to have a chat on this. I mean, I'm going to keep this brief. We see this all the time, and it can be quite depressing. So I don't want to destroy a day. But obviously, the clock is ticking in a way. We're due to hit the 1.5 degree global warming threshold now, as it seems, and the impacts are quite devastating. But there is a lot of stuff that we can do about it, and I'm definitely part of the crew that, even though we will hit 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and probably also the 2 degrees at least, the more we can reduce, the better it will be for all of us. So if we probably, via the next couple of COPs, try and limit climate change by 2.5 degrees or something like that, that's still better than not working on it. So I do want to encourage everyone that it's not like everything is lost just because we have had a couple of pretty bad decades of late. So what can we do? I really love this graphic. This is what my partner has created. It's the bathtub graphic. So basically everything, all the water that is in the bathtub is the carbon budget. That carbon budget is there to keep the 1.5 degree warming threshold. Same scenario if we look further to 2 degrees and so on, just have a bit more budget maybe left. And the tap is the greenhouse gas emissions that come into the bathtub. And then you've also have a plug hole, which is the greenhouse gas removal. So, for instance, planting trees, carbon removal technology is a big new thing. Any sort of that removing from the atmosphere, and it's really then a play between turning off the tap and widening the plug hole to keep the remaining carbon budget in the bathtub to keep us at whatever target we aim for, 1.5 degree or 2 degrees, and so on. So I really like that analogy to kind of illustrate how reducing carbon emissions for organizations and the greenhouse gas removals, how they play together to achieve the same objective. How do you actually do it? This graph to the right is quite interesting, shows 73% of the global greenhouse gases are really focused on energy. So Holly will know all about that. This really where it all comes from in the end is the energy production of just everyday life and offices and construction sites, manufacturing plants, and so on, but also the energy that goes into producing products, producing services. So that's really the big focus on how we source our energy in the future. But the main point to have any climate action done for organizations is to have a proper carbon footprint, which means measuring data. quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really anything around the operation side of things and the direct impact that you can have in your organization, but then also the wider stakeholdership and supply chain, clients, customers, and so on. And really trying to nail all of that number down so that you can then afterwards create any sort of target and have at least some awareness on what sort of greenhouse gas emissions your company emits. The way that this is being done, there's a lot of, as I said, standards, regulations, frameworks out there. But the main one here in terms of climate change is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that has tried to quantify greenhouse gas emissions from organizations via scopes 1, 2, and 3. And what I was trying to do is to go from more direct impact and more direct responsibility to more the indirect impact, where it's also harder to do the decarbonization, but more and more important. So scope 1 means when you burn actual fuels or actual gases. So that would be, for instance, in any sort of vehicle fleets, it would be the offices and the natural gas. That would be the scope 1 emissions, because you've got very direct, in most cases at least, very direct impact on it. Scope 2 is then one layer less direct, because that says anything that comes from a grid system. Usually in the UK, that means the electricity grid. So you have more impact on it than with the supply chain, but you're going through an energy provider, so you can't do a lot about it, in contrast to the actual fuel you would burn on site, for instance, if you're a construction company or the likes, or in the office buildings, of course. And then scope 3, as you can see from that graphic, that's everything else, and usually the biggest part of emissions in total. So roughly 90% of most organizations I've worked with, their emissions sit in scope 3. So that would be the employee commuting, the business travels, the waste, the water, but most of all, normally the materials or services purchased by the organization, so the supply chain. So if every organization would deal with their supply chains in whatever shape or form they are able to in terms of climate action, then obviously you've got that through a chain, and then I think things would be much better, and the targets globally would be much easier reach. So the supply chain, the whole value chain, is really where the action is mostly at. But again, saying this is the more indirect approach, is really hard to talk to, let's say, Microsoft, if you have any sort of Microsoft products that we all probably use. Really hard to tell them you need to decarbonize. Much easier to also start on the scope 1 and 2 to do something about the electricity you're using, where you're sourcing it from, the natural gas. Do you use a combustion engine in your company cars, or are you like B on EVs, for instance? So that's very the 3 different layers of carbon emissions. And then once you have that done, painful exercise of getting some numbers down, what do you do with it? Like a lot of companies, unfortunately, when it's about reporting, especially in the financial space, they stop at this point. They then know, okay, those are my scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but then they do very little with it, which is quite sad. But then obviously what we want to see afterwards is to set actual reduction targets. They can be quite flexible depending on the sector and size of companies, if there's obviously some regulation against them. But we want to see some targets to be set, especially absolute reduction targets, so the actual number going down, or also carbon intensity reduction targets, which is normally carbon divided by revenue, so that you can see sort of the carbon you put out versus the revenue, so in terms of a productivity target. And normally the climate targets are either 2030 based, sort of like the short-term, medium-term goal, and then 2050, which is the actual net zero goal to reach minus 90% against baseline. And then once those targets are set, obviously it's all about what can we do to actually make those targets happen and not just talk about it. I've just noted a couple of ideas here, because that obviously depends on each business. But electrification of offices to get away from using any natural gas is a huge thing. Any sort of laptop cooling. Any sort of electrification of vehicle fleets, for instance. We use also a lot of stopgap fuels. So for instance, hydrotreated vegetable oils is often used in fleets where EV switchovers aren't immediately possible. Business travel reductions, prioritizing virtual meetings like this one is a huge thing for a lot of businesses, especially when they've got international clients and private jet travels and so on. It's huge for big organizations. And then obviously anything around the supply chain, sustainable procurement policies, engaging supply chain on good data, having them set sort of their own carbon reduction goals, then also obviously prioritizing using lower carbon materials and services. So actually engaging the supply chain to say, hey, do you have lower carbon services? What's the numbers? What's the carbon emissions per product? And that's really what we're trying to achieve. Slightly over time, but this is the last slide. Just different drivers for different organizations. A lot of organizations will benefit from climate action in terms of winning future business, especially when their clients and their customers have their own sort of like climate targets through regulation and public pressure. Market reputation is huge, obviously. Employee engagement, I do think that a lot of increasingly employees are more aware of the issues and do want to work for organizations that do take this issue into consideration. Regulatory requirements depends on size and sector. And then also just to say, if we do want to meet the net zero target by 2050 as a globe, then we obviously all have to work together. I hope that was interesting, and thanks for the time, and thanks for listening.